Welcome back, everyone. So glad you came. This is the session on risk perception and risk communication. Happy that we persuaded this many of you to come, and I think there are people still coming in. I think we've got a terrific session for you this morning. I wanted to make just one announcement, and that was one of the presentations that I mentioned last evening from Doug Story at Johns Hopkins. He is unable to be here, so we will have only 3 presentations. I think they were all happy to hear that Doug was not coming because it gives all of them a little bit more time. So we will have a good amount of time for their presentations and discussion. And the order of the presentations will begin with David Ropeek. I'll just make a brief introduction, but I think you will all have these bios. There's a document outside the door with full bios of all the speakers. But David is an instructor at Harvard University. He specializes in risk perception and risk communication. He has just authored a new book, How Risky Is It Really? Why Our Fears Don't Always Match the Facts. I know it was reviewed in the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago. I assume you're going to be plugging it here, David. Second presenter will be Jessica Ludi from the University of California, Berkeley. She is a research specialist and a lecturer. And she is going to be talking about floods, as I mentioned to you last evening. And finally, the third presentation will be from Todd Kozane. Todd is the co-founder of Second Muse. Second Muse is the organization that has put on this entire virtual Web 2.0 network for this conference, doing some really innovative work, and we'll be talking about how social media can bring tools to us working in disaster management. So that's the program. Questions, as in the earlier session, if you have a question, please write it down, and the young woman in the orange shirt will take those questions and bring them up. So we're going to handle questions in that way. We'll do all of the presentations and then open it up to questions. So let us begin. David, thank you.
Thank you. There we go. I don't like things in the way, so forgive me for being out here. Forgive me to the camera person who has to move around with me a little bit. I'm enormously honored and pleased to be here. And let me tell you a little bit about me so that you can decide how much of what I have to offer you want to place stock in. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. The stuff I'll be talking about is the stuff that smarter people than me have figured out, which I have researched and brought together in this book, which this will be a 10-minute or 15-minute summary of. I am a journalist. Was a journalist, remain a journalist, mostly. Now I consult in this stuff and risk communication and so forth, but really I still think of myself as someone who gathers information, coalesces it and communicates it. That's important and useful to people. So when I was a reporter, I would see stories constantly, like floods, like tornadoes in Massachusetts, yes, hurricanes, certainly, where people's fears didn't seem to match the facts. And it didn't matter what the risk was. It would always happen. There would be some gap between their fears and the facts. Sometimes people would be more afraid than the scientific experts said they needed to be. A lot of times, as with floods, for example, a lot of people weren't as afraid as the experts suggested they ought to be. So I observed this phenomenon enough to figure, wow, scientists might have studied this, and it turns out they have. And so in a conference called Understanding Risk, albeit about one kind, really, disasters, and albeit with a lot of technological focus, it's terrific to have these 15 or 20 minutes to help explain more broadly what risk means. And to do that, I'm going to ask you some questions so that we have a conversation about this for the next few minutes. What does risk mean? So here's the question for you, and if nobody raises their hand, I'll call on you or somebody, so it'll happen. If you were writing the definition of the word risk for the dictionary, You're not a disaster manager, you're not a World Bank, you're not a professional, whoever you are. You're writing it so if a high school student read the definition right next to the word risk, what would it be? Anybody want to volunteer? Told you I'd call on you. And there's no right or wrong, you know. By the way, there are a handful of common risks, 5 or 6 of which are physical, snakes, spiders, the dark, rodents, and half of which are social, one of which is public speaking. Which, by the way, and I'll get to this, trigger the same fight or flight response organisms and chemistry in your brain. Seeing a snake and how he's feeling right now are triggering exactly the same survival mechanisms. And the reason for that is, I'm way off my topic already, the reason for that is snakes threaten your survival, so does rejection by the tribe. We're social animals. When people don't respond to your tweets, or public speaking, or being fired, or rejected in a relationship, that's rejection by the tribe. We depend on our tribes for our survival. So we're acutely sensitive to those. Anyway, you still have to define risk.
I can help you out.
Go ahead. Anybody.
Probably, I will lose something which I value.
You will lose something. Okay, so yeah.
I value.
The risk is, that's interesting. So Shelley Leibowitz, was it, last night from the World Bank, said risk is anything you can model, right? She talked about all the quantification things. So she came up with this, and that's part of the definition that I'm adding, probability, calculability, numericalness. In fact, who was it? I think it was Rowan used the word risicare. Was Rowan here? Yeah, risicare, the origination of the word was when we could start to calculate the odds. And, when Blaise Pascal and all these people started to be able to calculate risk, we invented insurance. Okay, so probability, but probability of, in your case, something bad. So in the financial community, it's not necessarily bad. It's good, right, too. But yours, for regular people, also has the probability of something bad happening. One would not say the risk of winning the lottery, right? You wouldn't use it in that sentence. So we have 2 basic concepts, and this is what is in most definitions. Risk is the chance, probability, calculability of something bad happening. Now I'll put you really on the spot. What does bad mean? Death. For somebody who has, not for some people who think death is good. Right? Right? There's some people who choose to end their lives because of their certain circumstances. For them, death is not bad. Anybody else? What does bad mean? Loss. Sure. Loss to you. What's your favorite? You follow football, soccer? What do you?
Hockey.
Hockey. You from a Washington fan?
No, from
Ottawa. Okay. How about them Blackhawks, eh? So loss for you is when the Ottawa Senators, lose. Loss for me is when the Bruins go up 3-0 and lose. But it wasn't lost to you. So that's lost, but it doesn't cover it, does it? Let me move on with the conversation because my time is so limited. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Bad is something that you don't want to happen.
Averse. Yes, something that you don't want to happen. But what you don't want to happen and what I don't want to happen is different. That's where we begin. Remember, the definition of risk is some calculable prediction about events that are bad. But bad is subjective. The perception of risk to the people that you want to have some impact on in preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. The perception of you people in this room, too, by the way, this is how the human animal does it, is subjective. Inescapably because of the wiring of the brain, which I will show you in just a minute. But before I get to that wiring, let me tell you very quickly about a man, this is summarized in my book, who had a brain tumor between the front of his head and the part of the brain in the bottom where emotions come from. It's called the limbic system. So his prefrontal cortex behind the forehead is where we all make decisions. It's where we calculate things. It's where all the modeling stuff happens in our brain. Okay? And the limbic system is where emotions come from. And to get the tumor out of his brain, they had to sever the connections between the decision-making and the feelings part. This is what happened to this man. This man could pass every psychological test and intelligence test and reasoning test and so forth as brilliantly as anybody in this room. But this man couldn't keep a job, couldn't keep a friend, because this man could not make a single decision. Why couldn't he make a decision? He had all the facts. He could use all the facts. But the facts had no meaning. Because the values that said brown socks instead of blue socks, or 10:30 instead of 9:30 to the dentist, any choice requires one set of facts to feel differently than another. It is not just quantitative, as we live our lives, right? So that man, Elliot was his name, is the wonderful living example of the fact that risk is always, always, always subjective. So let me show you the brain stuff. There are 2 bullet points there that I want to explain biologically. Start with the neuroscience. My book summarizes what several fields of science say, help explain about how fear works. So the first point is we fear first. We use the subjective, instinctive, affective side of things first. And our brilliant reasoning mind, second. And that's initially. But in an ongoing way, about those survivors of flood that you were talking about, in an ongoing way, we use the emotional parts more and the thinking, reasoning parts second. There's a wonderful quote from a cynic and a humorist named Ambrose Bierce. He wrote this earlier in the early 1900s. He said, brain, definition, the organ with which we think, we think. That's really important for risk, because if you're a disaster recovery people, preparation people, you have to understand how the subjective risk perceptions arise. So let me, whoops, there we go. Okay, so I want to impress upon you this is not just the mushy, soft social science psychology world. This comes from the hard world of how your physical brains are all built. There are 3 organs here that matter the most. Let's see if this works. No, whatever. The cortex is the wrinkly part that many people think of as the brain, but is really just a layer on the outside. And it's where we think. Many parts of the brain contribute to thinking, of course, but it's where, among other areas of the brain, it's the area where we do higher order thinking. And particularly the prefrontal cortex is where we do a lot of decision making. There are 2 other areas that you need to know for this biology. One is the hypothalamus and an area around it called the thalamus. And that works like a relay station. So it has lines from certain areas in the brain just in, and lines that take that information. The thalamus will process it a little bit, and it'll send it on to specific designated areas in the brain. So it's like a bus station or a rapid transit station. Okay? And the third area here is the amygdala. That's the one in the bottom. Amygdala. It's about the size of the top of your thumb, and it's the principal part of your brain that's responsible for recognizing danger and keeping you alive. It's where risk perception, it's where fear and risk perception begins, or does not. So let me describe the mechanics here. Whoops. I should stop using this thing, huh? There we go. So let me describe to you, has anybody ever heard of a green mamba snake? Okay, it can stand up on its tail as tall as you. It lives in tall grasses in Africa, and if it bites you, it's also called a 3-step snake because that's all you have left. You don't want one. So imagine you're walking somewhere, and out of the corner of your eye, and you're on a cool safari in Tanzania somewhere, right? And you're in a sugarcane field, the habitat that the snake lives in. And it's late afternoon, and the lights are shadowy and so forth. And the leaves rustle over there. You hear it, and out of the corner of your eye, you see movement. What do you do? What do you do? Freeze? Freeze? Who votes for inputting all the data into a computer model and doing a fact-based risk analysis? That's not adaptive. Adaptive meaning a trait that will help you survive. The people, the pre-humans who thought, let me think about this, and got bitten by the black mamba, they're out of the gene pool. Quite literally, right? And that's good for us, right? So what happened is we evolved instead the reactive. the instinctive, the fight or flight, or in my book I call it the fight or flight or freeze response, because every time I ask an audience this, freeze is way high up the list, so I call it the fight or flight or freeze response. Well, here's how it begins. So this is the line, and it goes up the optic nerve, and before it even gets to the back of your brain that processes vision, it gets to the thalamus. It's the first place the information arrives, both from outside, and if you had a memory right now, the memory would be a bunch of neurons all firing together to form that little story, and the first place it would go would be to your thalamus. And the thalamus makes a little bit of sense of it. In this case, it kind of clears up the picture a little and sends it to two places. It sends it to many places. I've highlighted two, where we think and decide, behind the forehead, and the amygdala. Remember I said the amygdala is where fear begins. Look at the length of the yellow lines. Where does it get to first? This is the human architecture of the brain. This is not mushy social science. If you say there's a flood coming or the levees are going to break or whatever, it goes the same way. It goes from the ear to the thalamus to the amygdala before it gets to the front of your brain to think about it. We are hardwired to use emotion and affect, which is how the amygdala can make sense of things, before it even gets to the fact-based modeling part of the brain. And then, in the ongoing dynamic, this is the last part of the biology slide, the amygdala does not wait around for the prefrontal cortex to feed its model data back. It says, freeze, which helps you survive. Sometimes. Sometimes it gets you into trouble, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Right? This is why the gap exists between our fears and the facts, because sometimes the amygdala doesn't know all of what it needs to know, and it uses instinct, and instinct is wrong. It's real, it's valid, but it turns out not to make the smartest choice. So what happens here now is the amygdala says, speed up your heart rate and, change your skin chemistry and sweat and all of those fight or flight responses that we have. Your eyesight gets more acute in the center, but you lose peripheral vision. This is the more stressed you are. These signals are all coming from the amygdala. I don't want to get ahead of myself with the biology. And what's important here is the red lines, this is quite simplified, and in my first slide, are we going to distribute the slides ultimately, Todd? Okay, so the first slide has a citation of whose science this is, Joseph Ledoux. The quite simplified statement here is there are more lines going out from the amygdala which start fear and say be afraid and fight or flight than there are lines coming back in to the amygdala from the thinking cortex saying, yeah, but here are the facts. So the hardwired architecture and chemistry of the brain also ensures, guarantees inescapably, that affect and instinct and feeling and all the things that help the amygdala decide right away, could this be dangerous or not, because it doesn't have a library of every fact, right? That all those parts have more influence on your response to risk in an ongoing way, not just at the beginning, than reason. The affective side of your brain has just literally more influence on the working inside of the cognition of, not the cognition, this is subcognitive, of the brain's perception of risk. So then the question becomes, there's one more bit about chemistry, and because I want to focus on this because this conference is largely about disaster and big bad events. And so those are moments of particularly high stress. And another thing that you really need to know about risk perception and risk communication pre, during, and after a disaster is what stress does to the brain. And basically it makes us stupid. It turns up the systems we need to fight the lion or run away from the lion or freeze, and it turns down the systems we don't need. So one of the things it does is it turns up your ability to encode memories. You want to remember this next time so you don't get into the same mess, but it turns down your ability to recall memories. Not something you need to waste energy on. Focus on the now. It impairs some sensory systems and heightens others. So your vision gets much more acute in the center and you lose it here. Same thing with hearing. But the last button is what matters the most. Stress, glucocorticoids, and a lot of chemicals basically turn up the systems that give even more of an edge to the affective and instinctive side of your risk response. And they turn down the memory and the smarts and the school and the education and all the cognitive parts. And it heightens the fact that when you're more stressed, it's more of an emotional response to the risk than factual, even compared to normal. Okay. So let's say Jessica is the point at which I have to make a decision about a risk. Whether to buy flood insurance, whether to buy the house on the river. Okay, just wait. Yeah, she'll tell me. Okay, so here's what happens in real life. For all of you, too. Okay? This is a theory, by the way, I'm going to describe now called bounded rationality. And this was conceived by a man named Herbert Simon. And basically, Herbert Simon's, the theory is simple, basically. We don't have all the facts, ever, really, or all the information, or all the time we need to go to Google and get the facts, or all the intelligence we need to understand hydrology and physics, and, you know, if we got all the facts, I could look them up, I still wouldn't be able to use them. In most cases in real life, our rationality is bounded, limited by lack of facts, time, or intelligence. So let's say Jessica is this point where I have to decide whether to buy the house. So, wow, this great house came on the market and it's got a great view of the river. Okay, so I'm going to look up the floodplain data. I'm going to look up the history. I even know that a 100-year flood doesn't mean that it might not happen next year. I know some stuff. I'm looking up real estate values. Somewhere along the way, I'm going to run out of facts before I get to my decision. Right? So what's going to fill in the blank? What filled in the blank? How did I judge that risk? If I didn't have all the facts or the time or the intelligence to use them, how did I fill in the blank? Emotion. Sure. Emotion, affect, instinct, experience, right? Culture. You're from different places in the world. Different cultures have different meanings. I don't mean to talk too generally, but basically all of the affective side of things. So there are two areas that I very want to quickly, in the last couple minutes here, go over that help explain what a lot of people have been kind of hinting at and asking about and suggesting in some of their earlier talks. We have mental shortcuts that we use to process the partial information we have. So let's talk about framing. How the situation is first described to you is going to have a lot to do with how your brain then processes the subsequent information. If I told the people in New Orleans that within 3 days I have it on pretty good authority that somebody's going to bomb the levees and flood the city, the flooding of New Orleans would have been framed differently, and people probably would have responded differently. The fact that it was framed as the storm meant that the people who had experienced Camille and the other hurricanes saw it in that frame. When actually it was flood the city. But the frame skews how we think about things because we have partial information. We have to decide whether to evacuate. Optimism bias was talked about upstairs. When a risk is off in the distance, we think it won't happen to us. We think our marriages will last longer than they do, and our jobs will pay more than they will, and we'll stay healthier than we are, all over the place. That's in the future. What happens, however, is as things get near, it shifts over to something called loss aversion, where equivalent gain and equivalent loss feels worse than the equivalent gain. Because when it's imminent, and that cool scuba trip you were about to take with the sharks, 6 months from now, and now you're on the edge of the boat and there's fins in the water, you're not optimistically biased. Your amygdala is acutely and chemically attuned to survival. And we become loss averse. Okay? And this bears on money decisions too. And finally, let me just talk briefly about representativeness here. Representativeness means we take partial information and we sort it against patterns that seem like that's where that data belongs. Okay? So, I'll give you an example of this. There's a professional athlete that I have arranged to come in here in 3 minutes. Is that person bigger than you or smaller than you? Let's just take a vote. Smaller than you. Nobody? Let's vote for bigger than you. Let's vote for you're asleep and you didn't vote. Okay. You don't know anything. You don't have nearly enough facts, right? So my facts brought you about like to here. And the rest of you you were taking the partial information and you were sorting it against the pattern that I framed, athlete means bigger. Could be a soccer player, could be a jockey, could be a ping pong player you didn't know. So you use the partial information when your rationality is bounded. That's one of the emotional or mental shortcut processes that we use to make judgments. This is very rushed, and there's more in the book. Last slide. So in addition to that area, and that area comes from a field of study that is sometimes called behavioral economics or heuristics and biases. It's basically research that was done by some people that won the Nobel Prize for economics for figuring out why people make stupid choices about money. I wish Mish Leibowitz were still here, the person from Wall Street. They determined a number of mental shortcuts that we use to make quick judgments with partial information. This field of science got another fancy name. It's called the psychometric paradigm. This has been done since the late 70s. By the way, this is scientifically robust evidence that is out there and available for you all as tools. You don't have to make this up. The science of why we perceive risks the way they do has been very well studied, thoroughly studied. It's frustrating that it's an available tool for emergency preparation and response and not being used as much, so that's why I'm glad to be here. The psychometric paradigm identified a number of characteristics of a situation that make it feel more or less scary. So we're not sorting information about the athlete into a category like representativeness would. We're just judging the amygdala, literally the amygdala. Judges, does it feel scary instantly? Let me give you a perfect example. A natural risk is less scary than a man-made risk. I just told you that if I had framed the flooding of New Orleans as something that was happening from a terrorist attack, it would feel different. What happened in your amygdalas, when I framed it differently, was I put one in terms of natural and one in terms of man-made, human-made. And we use that to judge whether wow, nuclear radiation, scary. Radiation from the sun, not so big a deal. Pharmaceutical products, let's regulate them. Herbal remedies. Joaquin and I could take some carpet dust and sell it with rainbows as magic Joaquin and David libido powder tomorrow in the store. We'd probably make a lot of money. Why don't we regulate herbal things the way biologically active drugs, the way we do pharmaceuticals? Because one's man-made and one's natural. So that's one example. There are several others up here. Do the people you're trying to influence trust you? You'll have more influence on them, regardless of what the facts are. They'll listen to your facts more. You'll be a better risk communicator. Do you have control? It's been said several times around here, and let me just end with this, because I'm sure I'm over. Let me just end with this. It's been said several times here and upstairs in the Black Swans and White Whales session that if people feel like they have some control, they freak out less. I don't want to use the word panic, that's a poorly used word, but their relationship to the fear changes. Let me demonstrate this with you, okay? No, let me give you an example. After 9/11, when flying had resumed, I actually came down to Washington 3 weeks after that, and was anybody in Washington then? There was an IMF thing, and there was an anti-globalization rally too. Oh my God, it was like the black guys with the machine guns and the helicopters were on the streets in Washington, D.C. It was very freaky. It was also very freaky to fly, because we had those images fresh in our minds, which is another part of the psychology. So many people, to travel long distances in the United States, drove instead. Why? Statistically, your prefrontal cortex is probably telling you that's riskier, right? Why? The word is right there. It feels safer. And 3 separate studies from different universities estimate between 300 and 1,600 more of them died in the 6 months after 9/11 on the roads than would have been expected in that time period. If our government had known that the psychology of risk perception absolutely predicted that response, then as good risk managers, they might have said, listen, live your normal lives or the terrorists win. You remember what they said? Giuliani said go shopping, and Bush said go to Disneyland. I'm not sure I'd chosen those, but we got the point they were trying to make. Suppose they had said instead, so for example, if we're all afraid of flying now, we're doing our best we can to make it safe, and we think it is safe, otherwise we wouldn't let the planes out, but flying is scaring us all now, so that recognizes the emotion. But don't forget, as you choose to travel, if you choose instead to drive because it feels safer, because it gives you that nice, comforting sense of control, that it's statistically much more dangerous to drive than fly. And man, if you hit a tree and die, you're a victim of the terrorists. Now, that's not eloquent language, but might that language have gotten people to think about the risk differently because you're invoking the language that was relevant to their perceptions in the first place? That's my point, and that's the point with which I'll close. There are sciences that, summarized in the book, that speak to, quite eloquently and in detail, the psychology that's going on in all of us, the human animal, and certainly the people you're trying to have some impact on to encourage a healthier outcome from disasters, that speak to the psychology that's going on. If you understand it, you can have a more effective risk management relationship with them. Risk communication, which I also advise in, is one tool for that, but you can set processes, you can build buildings, you can do a lot of things to respond if you respect that risk will always be subjective, and you can know the subjective characteristics at work in the risk that you're dealing with. So forgive me for whatever time I stole. It wasn't working real well for me, so I wouldn't trust it. I just went back to the machine there.
Just to ask David, please write them down and hand them in or hold them up and we'll collect them.
I guess I'll be speaking from the podium. Good morning. My name is Jessica Ludi, and I'm with the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management at the University of California, Berkeley. I've been told most of my life that I don't need a microphone, but for today and the taping, I'm required to use one. So if at any point I get excited or a little too loud, just do something like this and I'll tone it down. Thank you very much. That David's talk just set a really great context for what I'm going to talk about, which is both perceiving and communicating risk. I'd like to talk about the public perceptions of flood risk in the United States under the context of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is our policy, and then also just briefly discuss a great example of what appears to be public awareness campaign in Germany, a successful example. So flooding is the #1 natural hazard in the United States in terms of risks and damages, yet despite a policy that we have aimed at reducing risk, we've still got rising flood costs and damages. And one of the key issues here is that land behind levees in the United States is no longer considered official floodplain, and so this has had the unintended consequence of increasing development behind levees. The Association of State Floodplain Managers reported that most residents believe that they would not be allowed to live behind a levee if it were not safe. And a recent report found that 55% of the U.S. population lives in counties protected by levees. So given that flooding is likely to increase in the future and that rapid floodplain urbanization, which is still happening despite the real estate crisis, we're putting more people at risk without proper hazard warning. Given also that behavior is tied to the perception of a threat, it prompts us to stop, take a step back and ask the question, how well do people living in lands protected by 100-year levees understand their true level of risk? This is the teaser slide from yesterday. What risk am I talking about? So I'm talking about residual risk. Currently, the National Flood Insurance Program, our policy, is based on a safety standard of the 100-year flood, which means there is a 1% chance of a flood occurring in any given year, not that it happens once every 100 years. However, if you're living on a property over the life of, say, a 30-year mortgage, this risk is actually 26% that you could flood from floods larger than the 100-year flood, and this is if the levee does its job. If the levee doesn't do its job, there have been studies that show this could be as high as 78%. Something to think about. So what we decided to do was survey one sub-sea level community in Stockton, California, in our Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, to see how they perceive risk. First, we wanted to look at what other studies had been done, and most flood risk perception studies in the United States and elsewhere have been done after a flood has already occurred. So nobody has actually said, are you aware you may be at risk before a flood has happened? We did find studies before a flood has occurred in both the Netherlands and Switzerland. So very briefly, and this touches on what David had mentioned before, specific to flood risk perception, the factors that tend to influence it are prior flood experience, that's the biggest one, trust in flood control structures, the media, misunderstanding of probabilities, trust in administrative bodies, and then also where people see the benefits in a certain situation, they tend to minimize the risk in their head, and then denial is a big one. So the National Flood Insurance Program was born in 1968 from the Flood Insurance Act in response to a series of floods that we had from hurricanes in 1963 through 5. And the goal of it was to find a way to insure people who were already living in flood-prone areas, because prior to this, people living in flood-prone areas were having trouble purchasing insurance. Nobody wanted to take on the risk. And additionally, the goal was to prevent further development in floodplains. It's administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It has 3 components. There's a flood hazard mapping component, a flood insurance component, and floodplain management. And the basic, this is a very simplified version, but the basic way that the program works is through hydrologic and hydraulic models. We try and estimate, or experts try to estimate, where they think the 100-year flood will reach on the landscape and how high that water will be. So if your property falls within that 100-year floodplain, there is no new development allowed. You're required to purchase flood insurance, and you're required to flood-proof your houses, which could be something like elevating it above the anticipated highest level of a 100-year flood. However, what we're talking about today is if you're behind that levee, that land is officially considered not floodplain. Therefore, there is no flood insurance required, and there are no building requirements. And I have it in red because this, to me, is a bit of a red flag. One of the criticisms of this program is that maybe it's created a moral hazard in an area that's flood-prone that you would normally not be able to build there. Through constructing a levee, we're now able to build there, and the land is often cheaper, not necessarily reflecting the risk that exists. So we build more, and then when the inevitable flood does come from either a larger flood or a levee failure, you've got greater consequences than would have been there if we had not built the levee in the first place. Additionally, there are other criticisms of the program, which is that perhaps the 1 in 100-year flood is not a high enough safety standard. Maybe we need to protect to floods that are larger. Additionally, the science behind it is uncertain because you need lots of years of hydrologic and hydraulic data to try and predict what you think or how large you think a flood is going to be in a given return period. And in the United States and in California, we only have about 150 years worth of data. So the science that's making these decisions of what is safe and what is unsafe is somewhat incomplete. Additionally, with the, as I mentioned before, and David mentioned, the 100-year flood is commonly misunderstood. Additionally, the flood insurance program could contribute to uninformed risk-taking because maps can be misleading. The old flood insurance rate maps, which says what's a hazard area and what's not, are often not geo-referenced, and again, they're based on this incomplete science. And the insurance rates are subsidized, so they're seen as too low, and people might not necessarily perceive that the risk is in fact quite high. So we developed a survey instrument with 20 questions where we asked residents about their perceptions about flood risk. We asked them if they were prepared, and additionally their levels of concerns and sort of whether they would evacuate or not, those sorts of questions. We randomly selected 500 residents in one neighborhood in Stockton, California, and we got a 24% return rate. It is a new development. It was built and it's still being completed in 2000. It's protected by a 100-year recertified levee, and again, that's a levee that's supposed to be large enough to handle a flood that is a 1 in 100-year flood, and it's in a very rapidly growing region of California in San Joaquin County. There are 1,284 units. It is below sea level, 1 to 4 meters, And the main results that we took away from this are that residents are not aware of the risk. They're not being told that they're at risk, and they're subsequently unprepared for a flood. This slide shows the responses to 3 questions we asked about perceived risk, confidence in the ability of a levee to protect them during a flood, and their level of concern over property flooding. And the text is small, but the dark red represents a greater level of risk awareness, and the lighter colors represent a lower level of risk awareness. And what you can see is sort of a trend on a greater number of responses are those lighter colors than the darker colors. We also asked residents how deep they thought the water would get at their property if a levee broke near their home. I'd first like to mention that even though we said if a levee broke near your home and you flooded, there were still 2 people who said my property would not flood. A majority of residents said the yard and the first floor. When we compared their response with how deep it actually would be, it showed about 50% of residents were correct, but then about 49% of residents were either uncertain or underestimated the depth. In their own words, we asked them to describe what damage they thought their home would sustain. Most people opted out of answering this question, and we did have a few who had somewhat of an accurate representation. Everything would be gone, a total loss, our carpets, floors, walls, and insulation. But then there were a number of people who said, hardly any damage, maybe just the front lawn, 6 inches at best, I would think. We then asked the million-dollar question, are you familiar with the expression 100-year flood? And if so, could you please define it? What's in black there is yes. 3% of the people said yes, and they correctly defined it. 52% said no. The group that's in red is of the most concern to us, I feel, because 32% of residents said yes, they understood, but then they defined it incorrectly, which is critical because it leads them to thinking that they are safer than they actually are. And this is what a typical response was. The last flood came in 1950, so the next one will be in 2050. Levees were made to protect us for 100 years. In terms of what information they're being given, 60% of residents were not informed that they may be at risk of flooding. 60% also reported rarely, if ever, hearing about flood issues in their area. 30% never heard about flood issues. And then we also asked them whether their real estate agent had mentioned anything about flooding to them. And only 6% of the people responded that they had discussed it. And of those, absolutely none of the real estate agents disclosed that they were at risk, because officially they're not in a floodplain. 20% of households have flood insurance, which is lower than the national average, but greater than the 2% average of the county. 13% of residents reported taking any precautionary measures. They mostly involved discussing evacuation plans, disaster supply kit, but nobody reported purchasing a boat, which is critical because that tends to be the way that survivors are rescued, is by boat. So I show you this slide to show that in the development, most residents earn $80,000 a year. Most households have a college education, and it's ethnically diverse. This is critical because awareness was found to be, when we looked at a small regression, independent of education and of income. So none of these folks, it's not because they were poor, and it's not because they were undereducated. What are the implications of this? That residents are being exposed to involuntary risk. That when someone moves into a land protected by levees, nobody is giving them the information that there still could be a chance of flooding. We've learned from literature that lack of flood awareness exacerbates the damage and the loss of life. And we suspect that similar flood-prone developments around the country are also unaware of their risk. So that brings us to the question that, contrary to what Mark said, I will not be answering this question today. Whose responsibility is it to raise awareness, prepare for floods, protect citizens? Do citizens, or do residents, and does residential development belong in floodplains? I don't know. I'm not going to answer that question here, but what is important is that we have thousands of people living behind levees in the United States right now, and we're not going to move all of them out. So what can we do to improve their awareness and hopefully affect their behavior? So we had the opportunity to go looking for strategies abroad, and this is me in the Netherlands last fall. My friend drew it. It really is me. Hopefully in search of people or agencies who were doing something a little bit better, and I was looking for risk awareness groups. And so everybody pointed me to Cologne, Germany. So I went to Cologne, and they are the most flooded city in Europe, according to the very credible Wikipedia. But the rest is not from Wikipedia, don't worry. There were two 100-year Rhine River floods back-to-back. They were 13 years apart. One was in December of 1993, and the other was in 1995. We wanted to look at who were the key players in this. So the city of Cologne is huge. They have a very proactive flood manager named Reinhard Vogt. And then, I'm going to butcher the German, but the Bürgerinitiative Hochwasser is a citizens action group dedicated to raising flood risk awareness in the city. So Mr. Vogt is very proactive. He's incredibly well connected to the city. When I was there, they told me that anytime a new business owner moves into the downtown, or when new people move to town, he goes right over and he introduces himself to them and says, "This is who I am and this is what we do, and hey, there's a chance you could flood. Let's talk about what you can do." He's very charismatic and dynamic, so he manages to capture the attention when they have these events. And he's involved with both citizens and the politicians, which is critical. The city itself is very committed to integrated flood risk management and awareness. They do citywide flood simulations on how to assemble the mobile flood protection elements, evacuation routes, etc. They do a lot of public outreach into schools and into the community. There is a Dunk Your Local Floodmaster Day where everybody gets to sink Mr. Vogt in the swimming pool. They have they go into schools. They have computer programs that tell people, that simulate a flood and how much time you have and what are you going to take out of the basement. Are you going to get grandma? Are you going to get mom? It goes all the way through these scenarios. They even had one of the flood managers on late night television just talking about it. And there are all kinds of high visibility exhibitions around the city which managed to get the attention. Additionally, there's a citizens action group which came after the first of the 100-year floods in 1993. They called it the Christmas flood. The citizens group felt that the government wasn't doing their job adequately, and that the government should have known more, that they should have informed the citizens. There was not significant loss of life, but there was a lot of damage to homes. And so they then decided to take it upon themselves to raise awareness in the community, and they weren't going to depend on the government anymore. So they've taken a very active role in promoting awareness around the community. They lobbied for and received protection against the 1% annual chance flood. This is a picture of a picture, but what it shows you, this is during the 1995 flood, where citizens from this group actually went out. That's the mobile flood protection holding back the Rhine River from the area. And they're out there with a meter stick, and she's holding up numbers of how high the water is. And then this information was going back to the city, who is in charge of the flood management. Additionally, they work with residents to flood-proof their houses. The waterfront in Cologne is actually the first line of flood defense for the city. So when they were rebuilding, they wanted to make sure that they built flood protection into this wall. What shows on the left is actually, it's a house that's got a car in the basement, not oil heaters and not a person living in the basement. So they've taken these steps to ensure that people know what to do. It's seen as a success in public awareness because the damages were reduced between the 1993 and the 1995 flood. It could be due to the high engagement among the public and the stakeholders. And what's really important is that citizens are not just told about the risk, but they're actually given the next steps that they can take to protect themselves. So where we'd be interested in going next in this research is maybe speaking more with people like David and others in the field who might know more about what motivates us to protect ourselves. Additionally, we're interested in looking at flood risk perceptions in less developed regions. And I don't mean developing, non-developing countries. I mean in regions that are flood prone, but there aren't yet dikes and levees built. because we want to know, is there a fundamental change in our relationship to natural processes like flooding and the perception of risk as soon as we build these structural measures? So I'd like to acknowledge a number of folks, very importantly the people in Germany who were very kind to spend 48 hours with me discussing this. And I won't take questions, that'll be later. Thank you.
Good morning. So just as a quick show of hands in the room, how many people on here have uploaded a video on YouTube? How many people have watched a video on YouTube? How many people have written a blog? How many people have read a blog? So just to give a sense of scope, how many people know, or what are some guesses about how many daily searches there are on Google? Any ideas? 1 billion? So there's 2 billion searches every day on Google. How many people have contributed to an article on Wikipedia? How many people have read an article on Wikipedia? Anybody have any idea how many editors there are on Wikipedia? How many editors? Just a wild guess. Yeah, I think it's a bit high, but it's hovering around 100,000. How many articles are there on Wikipedia? All languages together. So there's 10 million articles. And there's about 750,000 people that read articles on Wikipedia. How many people have a Twitter account? How many people, just a question, how many people would be interested in blogging or have an interest and have not yet blogged? Okay. So there's this incredible revolution that's happened with social media in sort of recent history. How many of you are familiar sort of with the term Web 2.0 and what that means? Okay. So worth explaining. So when people refer to the first web, if you take the history from carrier pigeon to pulpit to radio to TV to the first web, one of the things that you see that might be common is that you have a central source of information that's being disseminated to greater and greater numbers of people. The sort of revolution that happened when people refer to the second web, or Web 2.0, is when instead of creating a site where I would create a site and I'll tell you, hey, this is what you should believe, regardless of whether I'm a person or regardless of whether I'm a government or a large corporation or whatnot, all of a sudden people started building, and it wasn't a technological change in the internet at all. People started building platforms to allow a ton of people to contribute. So when I say Wikipedia, this is an expression of sort of the second web. When I say YouTube, because who's the journalist of YouTube? There's not. There's a ton of journalists. Who's the editor on Wikipedia? There's not. Who's familiar with what this is on the screen? Does anybody recognize this? Yeah. What is it? So this is actually really interesting. You guys know who Ashton Kutcher is? So he's an American celebrity. He plays pranks on people and has a show and is going to be in a movie. And he was searching the web, and he found out that he had over 800,000 followers on Twitter. And he looked at CNN, and he said that they only had 50,000 more than him. And so he put out a challenge to them. And he said, I will do something vulgar in Ted Turner's home if I get to be 1 million followers before CNN. And he put the challenge out. And CNN responded. So Larry King put out a video where he said, do you know who I am? Do you know who we are? You know, we're CNN. You think you could beat us? We're going to take you. You know, we're going to drown you. We're going to smother you. Well, it was shortly after that CNN realized that they actually didn't own the Twitter account that was over there. So they promptly bought it. They had been collaborating with the person who actually built it. But it was, so they raced to Twitter. And then at one point, what Ashton Kutcher said is, if I reach 1 million before CNN, I'm going to donate 10,000 mosquito nets to an organization called Malaria No More. And so he won. But as he put it, the real victor was not the recipient of $10,000 mosquito nets. It was actually $90,000 mosquito net, 90,000 mosquito nets from 40 different countries that were donated to this agency. And this over here was the single most tweeted tweet, I believe, for last year. So examples like this, and we've heard a number of other examples, give us this impression that this isn't a toy, you know, like, to get philosophical on you for just a moment. What David had mentioned is really relevant. He said something that I think is really important. And it's that we don't necessarily, he said we don't respond to risk, we respond to the perception of risk. I would say we don't respond to reality, but we respond to the perception of reality. And I think that as we perceive of a reality of whatever it is, structure of reality or the human body or the ecosystem, we learn these things and we model our entire social systems off of what we know to be true. And if we're honest with ourselves, and we look at kind of current structures of society, whether they be corporate organizations or government organizations or how we go about things, and we think about why is it that we're doing these things? You know, what's the origin of this? And I think it's worth considering, and I'll say it a little bit bluntly, but we've lived in a world where the few have led the many. You know, our educational system is based on fairly rote training for the most part. You know, our organizations, if we look at them closely, a lot of them kind of resemble these medieval monarchic hierarchies, you know, where you have the king or the queen, and you have your lords, and you have your knights, and then you have your peasants. And there's a strong perception over here, which is that you know, certain people have the capacity to lead, and they should lead, and the majority should follow. And it's so much so that it influences what we see, the data that we see through science. So, for instance, when I was going to graduate school, I learned that the human cell was composed of a cellular membrane, and it had this matrix inside of it, and it had all these pieces, you know, ribosomes and whatnot, the machinery of the cell. And inside of it, there was another membrane, and it was the nucleus of the cell. And this nucleus of the cell was operating like a command, sort of military command HQ center. So it was this buffered central entity within the society in which it lived, and it would essentially direct and command everything to operate. And this is how I learned it, and this wasn't too long ago. But we've had an increasingly growing body of evidence that actually much of the executive function of the cell may actually be carried out by the membrane of the cell. And that the membrane of the cell itself is this entity that's kind of continuously increasing its consciousness of its surrounding environment and reality by changing its protein channels and readjusting itself and reinventing itself and searching for change, how it happens. And then when it sees that change, it signals the nucleus. So it essentially tells the nucleus through cascading protein channels and whatnot, the environment's changed, you need to change this way. Now, what's fascinating about this, in particular, is that we saw the cell and we saw the cellular membrane and we said, oh, a small buffered element in the interior must be dominating and directing the rest. Which is surprisingly similar to the way that we direct many of our societies. But when every once in a while we see something that causes us to shift our understanding of the structure of reality, which has to be accompanied by a shift in the way that we do things. And what I would like to sort of submit for your consideration is that one of the things that this Web 2.0 revolution, the radical sort of proposition that it's made, is that of all the people on the planet, everybody actually has something to say. Now, all of us are accurate to some degree, and all of us are inaccurate to some degree, but if we can find effective mechanisms to bring a coherence to this ecosystem, and if we can find ways to have each of the individual people meet with each other, which is the main thing that sort of social media and the new media has done, that these reactions will provide fruits that we don't even know exist yet. I would also propose that although we've heard a number of things that are happening right now, I'd like to suggest that we don't really know the effect of new media and digital media on disaster risk management. We have some ideas, but if we look at a tweet for a tweet, and we try to replicate kind of what has already happened, we have a limited sort of effect that it may have. But if we try to go to the root of what does this philosophically mean, what does this say about how we interact with each other as people, then we get to use that to do things in a very different way. So I'm going to give you a few very short examples of projects that I've been working on in the last few months that speak to this. One is that we're doing, for a number of companies, we're working on what we're calling digital audits, and a number of people are doing this. So if you wanted to find out what the perception of people is, or what people are thinking or talking about, what do we normally do? We poll, we pick up the phone, we get a sort of a subset of a population, we get some data, and then we, using some statistical magicry, we say this is our best guess, and we get better at it all the time, at what our best guess is. Well, with the phenomenon of social media, you have millions of people interacting with each other and speaking to each other, and you can use tools like natural language processing or sentiment analysis to use machines to actually search these millions and millions and millions of comments that people have made and get extremely interesting data, very high fidelity data, that says this is when people speak in association with this term or with that term, this is what they're saying. So in terms of disaster risk management, we can have a perception and get actual data about what people are thinking in ways that are powerful beyond the belief because we haven't even considered to go out there right now. One of the principles also that underlies this is this notion of unlikely partners. And what we see Web 2.0 do is create a lot of unlikely partners. So a project that we did a few months ago, the partnership was with NASA, USAID, State Department, and Nike. And the premise of this initiative, it was a sustainability initiative. And the premise was that really great innovation that could be totally game-changing for the world of sustainability may never see the light of day. Because you need a perfect storm to take something from idea to execution. I mean, you need the right money, the right team, you need a lot of things that are right in line. So our first module was water. So we scoured the earth, and we did, and I think there's a ton of learning, and we could do it a ton better. But what we tried to do is that we tried to look to all the fringes using every tool that we had. We had, digital bots and whatnot that sort of searched out there to see what is actually out there. That if it were to be successful would actually be a game changer in the world of water sustainability. Then we brought these 10 people in a room and we brought together the perfect storm. So we had the CTO of Intel and the CTO of USAID and the number 2 person at NASA and a ton of people that came in there. And the entire focus was on getting these 40 people to work together to help make these 10 more likely to succeed. So the challenge that we were immediately faced is if you're bringing a ton of unlikely players together, there's a new science that needs to evolve of the science of collaboration. How do you structure something so that people that have never worked together or are unlikely or don't know anything about it can actually collaborate successfully and we don't have too much time, like right off the bat? these are questions that I think must be answered by the people in this room. These are questions that cannot be wait for experts to come out. I think that there's a quote that has often inspired me, and it's that in these times of change, it is the learners who will inherit the earth, while the learned will find that they have been beautifully equipped to deal with a world which no longer exists. And I think in this case, we're all learners. When something is this new, we're certainly all learners. The other one that I will spend just a few seconds talking about is random acts of kindness, which was mentioned earlier. The attempt of what we're trying to do in random acts of kindness is create technology solutions. But the partnership, which is Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, NASA, and the World Bank, who clearly have internal capability to create incredible solutions for problems, instead the solution that we're trying is to saying, let's have a bunch of different events where we're bringing together disaster risk experts or specialists from anywhere in the world, bring them together and bring a local volunteer technical community together as well to see if we can solve some of these solutions at the grassroots. And we're doing it right now in Sydney, Jakarta, Nairobi, Sao Paulo, Santiago, and DC this weekend. The other most obvious example, and this is, first I'd like to ask a question, how many people signed up on the websites, on the Understanding Risk websites? I think that we have a real opportunity here. One of the things that you may notice is that in a conference of 400 people, 100 people are speakers. I would submit that we're about a fourth of the way there. I think that one of the things that we will need to figure out, and this has to be this community that's going to figure out, is how are we able to achieve a certain coherence in this ecosystem of disaster risk management? How can we find a mechanism when we're dealing with problems that are unprecedented to meet it with a collaboration that's unprecedented? And as such, I could have named the title instead of New Media, New Medium, because I think that's really what we're facing. Thank you very much.
Are these mics working? Yes, they are. Very good. Well, thank you first to all three presenters. They were fantastic, each one. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions. Again, if you have any that you would like, please write them down so they can come up to me to pose to our panel here. And then you're certainly all also welcome to come up and take a mic and just do it spontaneously. Here's one question that came up, and I'm going to put this out because it's really a question for all of you. And while you're thinking about that, maybe I will pose one question to our panelists. But this question is, are there any examples of how you all, the people in the audience, have been able to influence the perception of risk and subsequent actions of stakeholders, especially in developing country contexts? So we would welcome what you can share about your own experiences, your organizations, or others that you know about where you have really been able to successfully influence perceptions of risk. So think about that for a minute, and hopefully we'll get some response to that. Do write down any questions that you have for any of the panelists. But let me just pose one, and I think it's more for David and Jessica, but not necessarily only for them. But I think both of you, well, I copied down one thing from yours, Jessica. What motivates us to protect ourselves? What motivates people to take precautionary measures? Because this is such an issue for many of these kind of programs, whether it's a flood program or trying to motivate people living behind levees to take some protective action. I know in the case of my own work, in pandemic preparedness, trying to get people to take the threat of a pandemic seriously and understand the social implications and to take action such as stockpiling food, water, medicines to prepare for the eventuality of such. And how many people take these precautionary measures small numbers, small percentages. And so the question is, and I think maybe particularly for you, David, just your thoughts. You presented some powerful ideas about emotion and fear and how those kinds of things influence our rational decision making. In the case of trying to motivate people to do things, I know there have been experiments in social science to try to increase fear, to arouse fear, to get people to take action. I think mostly those are discredited approaches. But I wanted to just ask you, since this is like a chronic challenge to those of us trying to take preventive action in our programs, what does your experience, and maybe Jessica the same for you?
One of the pioneers in the psychometric paradigm research on the psychology of risk, the factors like trust and control and nature, those sorts of things, is a fellow named Baruch Fishoff, who said in a book that I commend to all of you called Mental Modeling, Risk Communication, a Mental Models Approach. Risk Communication, a Mental Models Approach. He observed, and there was a fellow from the West Indies, that it's a risk that has to be managed. What I call it in the book is the perception gap. When we're more afraid than we need to be or less afraid than we should be based on the facts of flood or whatever, our behaviors can be a risk in and of themselves. A risk that has to be managed, not just by building the levee, but how is it going to change people's behavior. So.
Okay, great. So there is actually a protection motivation theory with which I'm vaguely familiar by Rogers, which has 3 parts to it. And it says the likelihood of an individual to take protective action is dependent on 3 factors. And the first is the perceived severity of the threat. The second is the perceived likelihood of the threat. And then the third is sort of self-efficacy. Whether or not something I'm going to do to protect against this 100-year flood or 500-year flood is really going to make a difference. Because they have found that where individuals feel like nothing they do would make a difference, they're going to be completely unlikely to take any protection.
Which, by the way, is one of the complaints about people saying climate change is real, but I'm not ready to spend any money or do anything about it. Because one of the theories is, what the hell can I do about that?
Yes. Do we have, what are we doing? Are we passing the mic down to people who have questions, or?
You want to answer your further previous question?
Yeah, I would still. I'm looking for answers. I see some hands either. Are you answering a question or are you asking a question?
To maybe both, but ask one mainly.
Good.
I don't know how it works, but I just my question is, I guess mostly to David, but to all, is, I don't know how to phrase this, is misperception of risk a luxury? Because the question that came up for me in all of this was, now apply this to poor people that really are expert risk managers from my perception, and they're really making the best decisions that they can, and a disaster is the last on the list because they're talking about feeding their children and having access to work and public transportation. So for me, they probably make much more rational or have maybe less misperception of these risks. And so how do we apply then all of this to them? I mean, you're talking about, what was the thing that you said about invoking the language that is relevant to people's fears and things. But there's the fears, but they're dealing with much more kind of realities. There's so many risks that they're juggling on a daily basis. So how do we apply all this? And maybe just because when I just came back from working with communities on climate change adaptation, you can't talk to them about climate change adaptation. Talk to them about weather and the stuff that they're dealing with now, and then you start talking to them. So that's my question.
That's a perfect example. And I've written about this. So who lives in climate? Who goes in the newspaper online tomorrow to find out how the climate's going to be? No. You look for the weather. Who lives in the globe versus in the neighborhood? Abstractions and non-relevant scale frames things outside the language that's relevant to how people will perceive them. That's why there is a movement towards talking, and someone talked about this yesterday, about describing it as best science can. Science has to be very careful about this. The specifics of what climate change will mean to local weather. That's putting it in the language of what can happen to me. What can happen to me is very important. By the way, statistics are lousy tools for risk communication. Here's one specific tip. 1 in a million is irrelevant to you because you're the one. Your job is not to help the other 999,999 survive. If you think you could be the one who eats the mad cow burger, you're afraid of mad cow disease. So you want to get people to pay more attention, put it in personal terms. That's one example. But you asked a much more profound ethical question there. Is misperception a luxury? Dangerous thing here. There are no misperceptions. People perceive risks in real ways as best they can to get their butts to tomorrow. There are mistakes. You get in a car instead of a plane and you drive it into a tree, that's an oops. All right? And there are mistakes with flood insurance and so forth. But it is, to me, completely unethical to call people irrational and counterproductive, to call people irrational or misperceptions. Because both of those imply, I'm smarter than you. And all the relationship that follows is worse, and you'll have less influence. But ultimately, those people who want to survive in the Brazilian rainforest who are cutting down trees, who know that the trees don't regrow in the rainforest very well, they know that, and they know they're going to have to move, but it's feeding their daughter tomorrow. Is that a misperception or not? I think for managers, we have to see where the oopses are and guide people towards healthier choices, but ultimately respect that it's up to them to choose. And humans are imperfect choosers about risk.
We're getting some questions now, including some on Twitter, but here's one for Todd. Web 2.0 and social media, a creature of youth, but young people are more comfortable with risk, don't believe bad things will happen to them, and have fewer assets, homes, businesses to lose. It's a dichotomy, it's a statement, but...
No, it's mostly it's definitely the younger generation that has sort of embraced that, which is I think why it needs to have balance. I mean, I think it is an incredibly powerful tool. But the tool is powerful. It can only be powerful to a certain extent in one segment of the population. I mean, we are a civilization composed of people of all ages, and it turns out that the people that have been around longer tends to, have a lot of experience that's super valuable to kind of guide our civilization forward. And so when that segment of the population is sort of not present in one of the most powerful mechanisms of communication that we have ever seen, then I think that represents an imbalance. And I think that that's why, I think that's all the more reason why it should be adopted or at least experimented with, by people who are older. I chose that. I chose that word real carefully.
Chronologically challenged.
A question for Jessica and then for David. Are there any good ways or how to ensure that people understand the 100-year return period? And then David, for you, any advice on how scientists can become more trustable as risk communicators?
I think that the best way to, I don't think there's a way to ensure that people will always understand the 100-year return period, because some people just may not. But I do feel that if in the scientific community and in policy and when we're up here giving talks, whether it's to other risk managers or no matter whom it is, if we're referring to the flood as a 1% annual chance flood and we start trying to change the language, then hopefully we can filter out the traditional 100-year flood. But right now it's still widely used. And I believe that actually when it came to be called a 100-year flood years and years and years ago, there were hydrologists who were trying to speak up a little bit and still shout out 1% annual chance flood, but they were quieted down, and so it's just kind of stuck.
Years ago, I was asked to give a talk at the National Flood Insurance Program's annual thing. It was in Minneapolis, right when the Mississippi was flooding, whatever year that was. The same question was asked then. I asked the same question of the Army Corps of Engineers in flooding stories I did as a reporter in the 80s and the 90s. They won't let go of the language. Lawyers protect it. A culture protects it. It's pretty easy. Stop asking the question by getting rid of the language. There are different ways to put the language. Let me be broader. There are resources that can help with explaining numbers to people. It's called, this phenomenon is sometimes called innumeracy, like illiteracy, only with numbers. And there's a wonderful global expert on this whose name is GERD, G-E-R-D, like gastroesophageal reflux disease, Gigerenzer. He has written a great deal about how to communicate numbers more effectively, risk numbers broadly. There's also somebody at Dartmouth named Steve Woloshin, W-O-L-O-S-H-I-N, who with his wife and colleague Lisa Schwartz has written terrifically about how to communicate numbers. The problem with numbers are twofold. We're largely enumerate. Okay, it doesn't matter education-wise. And numbers aren't all that matters. It's how the numbers feel. If you think you could be the one, you may understand what 1 in a million means. Too high a risk? Thank you. I want it to be 0. So, thoughts on the numbers. The question that you asked, scientists being more trusted, that's really an interesting question. Because if you ask the public who are among the most trusted sources of information on risk, scientists are at the top. So I have a feeling that... Who asked that question? Untrusted scientists? Somebody getting on your case or something? That's a curious question because usually scientists say, how do we communicate better? But they don't put it in terms of trust. Now, how you can communicate better, let me refer you to a wonderful resource by a friend of mine. Her name is Cornelia Dean, D-E-A-N, who has written a book. You're nodding. I forget the name of it. Cornelia Dean, How Scientists Should Communicate Better. She's the former editor of the science section of the New York Times. It's marvelous. Just read it. It's terrific. It's like, let go of your jargon, see the information through the public's eyes, let go of all the tiny little qualifications and ambivalences that are scientific. See the need for information through the recipient's eyes, but Cornelia Dean's book is awesome.
Really quickly, just in defense of the Army Corps of Engineers, and I don't work for them, but there is a member in the audience, I believe they actually are trying to drop the language of 100-year flood, so they are letting it go.
Awesome. So, it'll take 100 years, but it will happen.
I wanted to come back to the concept of the T-year flood, the 100-year flood. There are movements to abolish the snow white midgets in the gardens all throughout Europe. They are stealing these midgets, and they don't want to see them. Why don't we do the same thing with T-year flood or 100-year flood? I mean, it's an engineering concept that is floating there for years with an unbelievable deterministic meaning, although it is not deterministic. The uncertainty on this term has completely disappeared, and as you mentioned, people believe that if a flood happened today, it will happen in 100 years, not an average on the next 100 years. So why don't we start with the web, try to abolish this term and come back to the probabilistic idea of what it means in terms of uncertainty and risk. The 100-year flood has an epistemic uncertainty which is enormous attached to it, and nobody cares about that. Okay, that is my comment, but I also would like to ask the other gentleman of the new generation, how can we somehow verify the enormous amount of information we get? Because among the precious pieces of information. We may have some virus, some awful piece of information which happened to me to look at Wikipedia. How can we take these elements out of our information?
So a couple of things. First, if I could actually just make a comment to the first question that was completely not directed to me, because that's what young people do. We go where we're not supposed to. I would actually like to propose that if this is something that you just said is a need, and you're proposing that this is something that we should do, that let's do something about it. Like, let's get together after this event or something like that, and if this is what we're thinking is something that needs to happen, I think that this is the purpose of events like this, is for us to come together and actually do something. I mean, with the people in this room, if we believe that this is something that we should do, well, let's do it. As far as the question, I think that unquestionably, when you get a huge amount of information, there's completely erroneous information and corrupt information. Sometimes it's just accidental. Sometimes it's explicit. I think that the way that I think it is that when you have one trusted source, you have single point of failure system. So if you have one editor who will always speak, you are forced to view through the world lens of that editor. And so if there's a single point of failure and there's a corruption in that lens, then 100% of all information that's going to come from that source is going to be gone. And so with the strength I think that you have of this is that you have so many points of information that you can't approach it the same way as you would approach the completely trusted single point of information. And I think that one of the things that was an example of what Ushahi was done is that that was shown. I think it was yesterday. It was shown in one of the presentations in one of the lightning talks that who are actively trying to see what are good mechanisms of filtering that information. And I think that one effective thing that you can have is that when you have large numbers of people working together, all filtering it, they did some tests on Wikipedia, and I really wish I had on the tip of my tongue what they are, but they forced inaccuracies within various articles on Wikipedia and looked for the time that it took for those articles to get corrected. And I don't think it's a perfect system, and I think that we're still refining it. And that clearly is something that we should consider, but I don't know if I addressed it effectively here.
Here's one question, then I'll come to you, but this was one that was written and handed up to me. There are millions of people who know that they are at risk, but who also know that there is nothing or very little they can do about it. For instance, people who live in adobe houses in seismic areas. What should we communicate to them? Maybe that's for everyone. I don't know. That's a tough question.
Well, there's one thought that comes to mind, which is this isn't just about words and messages. This is why a World Bank and other places exist. I used to think that what I do is consult in risk communication based on knowing how to talk to people because you understand the emotional language that's relevant to them. That's really not what we should be talking about. We should be talking about risk management for the people in the adobe houses in seismically active areas, not with words. Risk management isn't just what you say. Risk communication is a risk management tool. Risk management is doing something about the adobe houses in seismic areas, like I was talking with John Harold and some other people about Howard Cunwer through about a risk analysis of sub-seismically robust housing in Turkey. You don't do a press release and fix the house. You fix the house. Risk management. This is about risk management, not risk words. They're just one tool.
My name is Mike Buckley, and I just retired from FEMA after 29 years, mostly working in the flood insurance program. So maybe this is not a question, but maybe a comment that you could further comment on. I think part of the problem is you've labeled a flood with either a 100-year name or a 1%. Everybody is at some risk, no matter where they are. The lending industry has dealt with that issue quite readily when it comes to homeowners insurance or fire insurance. They just require it. So I think the conundrum is you got the government requiring it in areas that they deem to be most at risk. So where does the lending industry play into this whole scenario? Not everybody in the floodplain has flood insurance. A lot of people have mortgages that don't have flood insurance in the floodplain. So maybe you could compare or contrast the difference between the fire, homeowners insurance, the lending industry, and the way the flood insurance program operates.
I think that's a topic to be considered over lunch, and you, sir, have the last word to kind of follow up with the panelists. The time has come to a close. Once again, thanks so much for 3 terrific presentations. Thanks to you all for coming, and thank you.